3 children were killed inside a home. The person responsible never tried to escape. A father, 3 children, and one question: why? This case did not take time to unfold. It did not leave behind unanswered facts. What happened was clear from the beginning. A father, 3 children, one moment that changed everything. There was no search for a suspect, no mystery to solve. Only one question remained: why? In June 2023, in Monroe Township, Ohio, a 911 call came from inside a home. The words were urgent. There were children, and something had already happened. Emergency units were dispatched immediately. Police and first responders moved toward the address without delay. But this was not a race against time. By the time officers arrived, the situation was already clear. There was no active threat, no uncertainty about what they were walking into. Inside the home, 3 children had been shot. It was over. Outside, the neighborhood had just begun to react. Sirens broke the silence, doors opened, people stepped outside trying to understand what was happening. From the street, nothing looked different. The house stood the same as every other home around it. No visible signs, no indication of what had taken place inside. But inside, everything had already changed. There were no unknown suspects. The person responsible was not missing. He was there. A father. That detail did not take time to uncover. It was understood almost immediately. And once it was, the case shifted. Because this was no longer about identifying who had done it. That part was already known. What remained was something else entirely. A single question. Why? Not a question that could be answered at the scene. Not something that would appear in the first reports. But from that moment on, it would define everything that followed. When the first officers entered the home, they were not stepping into uncertainty. They were stepping into something that had already happened. Inside, the space was quiet, not calm, but final. 3 children, all in the same place. There was no need to search, no sign that anything was still unfolding. Everything had already come to a stop. One of the children had tried to get away. That detail would later become part of the case, not because it changed the outcome, but because it showed how little time there had been. Outside, the contrast was immediate. Neighbors had begun to gather at a distance. Some stood in silence. Others tried to ask questions no one could answer yet. They could see the emergency vehicles. They could hear the urgency. But they could not see inside the home. From the street, nothing explained what had happened. No forced entry, no visible damage. It looked like every other house. Inside, officers moved carefully. Every step controlled. Every detail recorded exactly as it was found. This was no longer about intervention. It was about documentation, because there was no uncertainty about the event itself, only the responsibility to preserve it. And one detail stood out immediately. This had not come from outside. What happened in that house came from within. What happened inside that home did not unfold over time. It happened in a single, continuous moment. The father took a firearm and shot his 3 children. There was no confusion about the sequence of events, no uncertainty about what had taken place. Everything happened quickly. One of the children tried to run. That detail would later be confirmed by investigators, not as a turning point, but as a reflection of how sudden everything was. There was no extended struggle, no series of escalating events, just a moment, and the outcome that followed. The children's mother was also present and survived with injuries. By the time officers arrived, There was nothing left to prevent. The event had already ended. And that is what made the case different from the beginning, because this was not a situation that required reconstruction. Investigators were not working to piece together what happened. They were working to document something that was already clear. There were no missing parts, no conflicting accounts. The facts were immediate, and they did not change. But that clarity did not make the case easier. It made it heavier. Because when there is no uncertainty about what happened, the focus shifts somewhere else, not to the sequence, not to the method, but to the moment itself. What leads to a moment like this? What happens in the space before it? Those were not questions that could be answered at the scene, and they would not be answered quickly, because sometimes understanding is far more difficult than knowing. When the answer is clear, the question becomes harder. Before this became a case, he was simply a father living in that home. There was nothing at first glance that set him apart. The house was part of a quiet neighborhood. The routine looked ordinary from the outside. No visible signs of conflict. No public indication that something was building. For the people around him, there was no reason to expect what would happen. Neighbors would later describe the same thing. Nothing unusual, nothing that stood out. He was seen as part of the environment, not separate from it. That is often how these cases begin, not with something obvious, but with something that goes unnoticed. In the early stages, there were no clear answers about motive, no immediate explanation that could make sense of the moment, only the fact that it had happened, and that it had happened within a family. That detail changed how the case was understood, because this was not a stranger, not someone outside the home. The person responsible belonged to the space where it happened, and that removed distance, the idea that danger comes from somewhere else. Instead, it placed it inside something familiar, something trusted. As more information began to emerge, the focus did not shift toward identity. That part was already known. It shifted towards something harder to define. What leads to a moment like this? Not in general, but here, in this home, with this person. There were no simple answers, and that absence would become central to the case, because sometimes the most difficult part is not what happened, but understanding how it could happen at all. There is a pattern people often look for when something like this happens. A warning sign. A moment that could have been noticed. Something that, in hindsight, makes the outcome feel inevitable. But in many cases, that pattern never appears. From the outside, everything seems ordinary. A routine, a structure, a life that follows familiar lines. Nothing stands out enough to raise concern. Nothing signals that something is about to break, and that is what makes it difficult to process. Because when there is no visible lead-up, the mind starts searching for one. People go back, they revisit small details, conversations, behaviors, moments that once seemed insignificant, trying to find a point where things changed, a moment where the direction could have been different. But sometimes, there is no clear turning point, no single event that explains everything that followed, only a shift that is not visible from the outside. And that raises a different kind of question, not just what happened, but when it truly began. Was it a slow build over time, or something that existed beneath the surface, unseen, unnoticed, until it reached a breaking point? Because in situations like this, what we understand is limited to what we can observe, and what we cannot see often matters more. There's also an assumption people hold on to, that extreme actions must come from extreme conditions, that something this serious must have a clear and equally serious cause. But reality does not always follow that logic. Sometimes the external world remains unchanged, while internally something shifts, gradually or all at once. And that internal shift does not always leave visible traces, no obvious signs, no clear warnings, only the result. And once that result appears, everything before it begins to look different. Moments that once felt normal start to feel uncertain. Neutral details begin to carry meaning. But that meaning is not always real. It is something we try to create after the fact. Because without it, the event feels incomplete, harder to place, harder to accept. And that is where the difficulty begins, not in what happened, but in the absence of a clear path leading to it. Because when that path is missing, understanding becomes something else entirely. Not a process of discovery, but an attempt to make sense of something that may never fully make sense. In the immediate aftermath, the scene was secured. Emergency responders confirmed what was already clear. There was nothing left to change. The focus shifted quickly, from the moment itself to everything that would follow. He was taken into custody at the scene. There was no attempt to escape, no confusion about who was responsible. The case did not begin with a search. It began with an arrest. As investigators moved in, the process followed a different path than most cases. There was no need to identify a suspect, no effort spent narrowing possibilities. Instead, every step focused on documentation. Evidence was collected, the sequence was confirmed, not to determine what happened, but to ensure that what was already known was recorded with precision. Charges were filed, multiple counts of aggravated murder. As details became public, the scale of the case quickly reached beyond the neighborhood. But even as information spread, one thing remained unchanged. There was no uncertainty, only the reality of what had happened. Once a case reaches this point, the process becomes structured. Evidence is collected, statements are recorded. Every detail is placed into a system designed to organize what happened. And in many ways, that system works. It identifies responsibility. It confirms facts. It builds a version of events that can be presented clearly. But there is a limit to what it can do, because a system can explain actions, it can establish sequence, it can define outcome, but it cannot always explain intention. And it cannot fully capture what leads to a moment like this. There is a difference between proving something and understanding it. One relies on evidence, the other does not always have something to rely on. In cases where the facts are unclear, the system focuses on finding them. But in cases where everything is already known, that focus shifts, not toward discovery, but toward interpretation. And that is where things become more difficult. Because interpretation is not fixed, it changes depending on perspective. Two people can look at the same set of facts and come to different conclusions about what they mean. One may see signs that were missed, another may see nothing at all, and both can feel certain. This is where the expectation of a complete explanation begins to break down. Because the system is not built to provide closure, it is built to provide answers. And those two things are not the same. An answer can be clear, precise, final, but still feel incomplete, because it does not address the part of the question people actually struggle with, not what happened, but why it happened at all. And that question does not always fit inside a structured process. It extends beyond it, into a space where there are no clear methods, no consistent rules, only attempts to make sense of something that may not follow a pattern we recognize. That is why, even after everything is documented, even after the case moves forward, the most important question can remain unchanged, not because it was ignored, but because it cannot be resolved in the same way as everything else. By this point, the facts were already clear, but clarity does not always bring understanding, and in this case, it didn't, because the most important question remained unanswered. Why? Investigators could document the scene, they could confirm the sequence, but none of that explained the decision itself. There was no single detail that answered it, no clear motive that made the moment understandable. There's another aspect that often goes unnoticed, not in the facts, but in the silence that follows them. When a case reaches this point, people expect something to emerge, an explanation, a statement, a moment that brings clarity. But sometimes, that moment never comes. There is no clear expression of intent, no direct way to understand what was happening internally, only the absence of it. And that absence creates its own kind of weight, because without something to hold on to, the mind continues to search. It replays the known details, looks at them from different angles, tries to connect them to something deeper, but not every action leaves behind a clear explanation. Not every decision can be traced back to something that can be fully understood. And that is where the difficulty becomes personal, because the lack of explanation does not stop the need for one. People still try to make sense of it. They still look for meaning, even when there is no guarantee that meaning is there to be found. And that is what makes the question persist, not because it has no answer, but because any answer that exists may never feel complete. Investigators would later consider whether the act had been planned, but even that did not fully explain it, because in many cases, time reveals a pattern. Here, that path was not clear. Only the moment itself and the question it left behind, because sometimes, even when everything is known, nothing feels explained. Some cases are solved, but never understood. As the case moved into the courtroom, the facts did not change. The charges were clear. Multiple counts of aggravated murder. The process followed its course. But outside the courtroom, the reaction was different. Shock, anger, and a need to understand. People did not question what happened. They questioned why. And that question remained beyond the legal process. This was not a case built on mystery. What happened was known from the beginning, but that did not make it easier to understand. Because some cases are not difficult, because they are unsolved. They are difficult because they cannot be explained. A moment, a decision, and a question that remained. Why? Some cases leave behind questions, others leave behind answers. This one left both. What happened was clear, but understanding it was something else entirely. Because sometimes the hardest part is not knowing the truth. It's trying to understand it. Next on True Echoes. The case in Ohio left behind a question that could not be answered. But sometimes, the question is not about what happened. It's about something harder to explain. In the 1960s, a man died in a plane crash in the mountains of southern Turkey. His story should have ended there. But years later, a child began to speak, not about imagination, not about dreams, but about a life he claimed to remember. A different name, a different past, and details that raised a new question. Not why, but how. Next on True Echoes, a story that was never meant to continue. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. There are cases where the truth is already known, where nothing is missing, nothing needs to be solved. And yet, something doesn't feel complete, because knowing what happened is not the same as understanding why. And sometimes, that question doesn't lead to answers. It only stays behind, quietly, waiting to be understood. What do you think? Can something like this ever be fully explained? Or are there moments that will always remain beyond understanding? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.